Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Paganini's second caprice, string crossing caprice. And well, before we get into our discussion about how to practice and how to think about this one, let's just start by listening to the first phrase or so, get our heads into the space of this tune. Then we'll jump right into it. All right, so what do we have here? Well, it's a really, really good caprice, or I do think of these as etudes. I just think there's so much that we can learn from them in order to practice, but it's such a good practice exercise for tone production, and especially string crossing, so we'll talk a bit about that. And then for the left hand, it's really good practice for extensions, learning to really feel what it means to cover the breadth of the fingerboard, and then of course also really, really good for intonation, just sort of due to the melodies, which have a lot of scales, arpeggios, and pedal tones built into those extensions and string crossings. So that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about, how we're going to come up with some ideas in order to practice it. And I would say my goal with this and the previous caprice that we discussed, it's more about just how much can I learn from it rather than preparing it for concert performance. And then of course, if you practice it with these sort of etude-like exercises in mind, certainly you'll be well prepared to build it up to a performance tempo. But definitely the focus of our conversation is going to be around practice patterns and just building and learning, improving our relationship with our violin, rather than how would we prepare this going with our sight in mind of a performance. So we're going to probably take it a little bit slower than you might perform it, and we're going to come up with different variations that we can do with our right hand and with our bow that might not be as applicable to a performance style. So that's just a little context for how we're approaching these. So let's get started with the right hand, talking about how we're going to think about the bow in the context of this caprice. And there's basically two concepts that I think we should really keep in mind the whole time. And the first one is cleanliness, and the second one is evenness of tone, but also of rhythm, of course. But cleanliness and evenness are the two things that I really, really want to keep in mind while we are practicing this. Then that evenness of tone and rhythm, I guess, becomes a little bit more flexible when we want to be expressive with our rubato, but absolutely we should start off by practicing it clean and even, and then viewing our expression as sort of a layer on top of that. So what do we mean when we say keeping things clean? Well, basically this is a string crossing etude, of course. We're going all the way, even first starting between the A and the E string, but then really crossing the full breadth of the bridge. And in order to make sure that our notes are clean, the most important thing we need to keep in mind is that when we are doing our string changes, that they only happen when the bow is not moving. And if we begin to change strings while the bow is moving, we're going to begin to get a couple extra notes in there. So let's have a listen to an example and counterexample. I'm taking measure 5, where we're going to be covering the breadth of the bridge. And here's what it sounds when we are playing cleanly, and we're only leaving the string once the bow has stopped. Change, play, 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 play. So that would be a clean example. We don't hear any notes in between from those strings that are between the G and the E string. And here's a less clean, so this is a counterexample. Don't do this. And you're going to hear some notes in between. So that was a counterexample, and what you noticed is that I was executing my string crossing before I've actually finished my note. And that means we're going to get notes in between from those intermediate strings. It might not have sounded terrible to you. I mean, I did take the weight off at least, and I even have some fingers down that may even be filling out the harmonies. So maybe it didn't sound terrible, but as we begin to pick up the pace, all of those little extra notes are going to throw off the rhythm. They're going to throw off the beautiful melody. And overall, it's going to become harder and harder to actually listen to the tune as you increase the speed. And so that's what we mean by cleanliness. And how are we going to achieve this cleanliness? And the idea is that, well, it's kind of a mathematical fact, believe it or not, that if we are changing from the down bow to the up bow, or from the up bow to the down bow, if we're changing the direction of any moving object, then there is at least one, even if it's an infinitesimal moment, where the object stops, where it has velocity 0. That's just mathematical or physics fact. If you're going from positive direction to negative direction, there's at least one moment where the velocity of the bow stops. And that's the moment that we want to hone in on for actually executing our string change. And we'll talk later when we practice our marteles about how to identify that moment and how to speed it up. But we really, really only want to be leaving the string when the bow has stopped. That's probably the most important advice for how to achieve cleanliness. And then let's talk about evenness as well. Evenness, I think it's probably a little bit less difficult to keep in mind, but basically the idea is that we want our up bows and our down bows to sound the same, no matter where we are, whether we're at the tip or playing at the frog, and we'll talk more about that later. But we want all of those notes to really, really have the same types of articulations. And then we'll begin to explore some changes when we want to bring out different notes here and there. But overall, we really do want to keep it even. And that'll let the rhythm and that'll let the melody shine. So cleanliness and evenness being our two focus areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as we get into some of the next level of it. Let's talk about the practice patterns and some of the recommendations we have here. And the practice patterns I'm going to suggest are actually pretty much the standard practice patterns that you might pick whenever you're approaching a string crossing etude or passage or exercise. And we're going to start off with our marteles in the upper half. That's really the bread and butter of the entire violin technique. So let's start off with that. And what you want to be doing here is making a super straight martele. Don't even begin your string crossing until it's done. And then cross. You can cross with your arm because we're going really slow. Taking time to prepare every note, even and clean. And then cross, 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 cross. And if we speed up to something which has more string changes, let's go to measure 22. Cross and start. Same thing. What you'll notice in this first approach is that I'm crossing the strings with my entire arm. So I'm not doing anything fancy with my wrist or with my fingers. This is a slow, basic martele exercise to understand the different arm levels. And that's really, really where I would start. As we begin to pick up the speed, we're going to explore what it means to be moving our arm and our wrist and our fingers a little bit more flexibly. But we should really, really start with that martele and using the space to get as quickly and with as minimal effort as we can to the different arm levels. So after practicing these types of marteles at the tip, the other type, the next stroke that I would practice is a spiccato stroke in sort of the lower half, and you'll find where your bow wants you to be depending on whether you're doing a brush stroke or something a little bit more bouncy. But the idea is that we do want to be coming off the string now, and we're going to add in that spiccato aspect. So let's just start again from the beginning, and we're dropping it. And you can choose for yourself how much horizontal motion you want, if you want it to be sort of a brush stroke. But the most important thing when you do these spiccatos is to recognize that it's horizontal motion with a vertical drop. And once again, we don't do any rotation of our arm to change levels until the stroke is done. So the same idea as the martele. Finish and cross. Finish and cross. Cross, cross, cross. And when we take it that slow, what we're really realizing is that that string crossing happens in the space in between the notes. So spiccato is a little bit easier to do for that than, like a connected martele. But that is indeed the next bow stroke that I think will be really, really useful to practice for this one. And, it's a different type of weight that's being activated when you change rotation, when you rotate around the strings at the frog versus the tip. So you're going to be learning a lot of really, really good control. Now let's come to our third practice pattern. And here we're definitely pushing past what we would do for a concert type of performance, but I would love for us to be doing some colles with our fingers. And colle, of course, is really sticky to the string and then coming off with our fingers, very active. And you can do this in different parts of the bow. You can do it in the middle. And just loosening up your fingers. You can even do it at the tip. And that's great practice for the evenness of your up bows and your down bows. And loosening up your fingers. And really feeling how it feels to stick into the string. And so those are basically the three type of introductory exercises I would do with this tune. The marteles, the spiccatos, and then the colles. The idea being to really isolate our arm string crossings to the spaces in between every note, or finger crossings if we're doing it with colle. Isolate to the spaces in between note and make sure that you execute that full martele or that full spiccato before you've changed, or that full colle before you've changed. So that's basically all the introduction. Now let's go to the next level, which is how do we actually begin doing two things. Number one being adding some expressive elements to our tone and even to our rhythm. And then number two, how do we actually speed it up? Because when we speed it up, we can't just be blocking our arm around. We have to be a lot looser. So let's talk about those two things. First of all, let's talk about making it a little bit more expressive. And I would suggest two different things. Number one, instead of our super straight up marteles, we're going to begin to let them sing a little bit more. But it's so important that we don't do this until we've practiced with straight marteles with stops. Otherwise, we're going to have that cruft in between the notes. So let's listen to the difference. Here's straight marteles with lots of stops. And here's where I start to add a little bit more singing martele. So you'll notice that the stop is not as harsh, it's not as basic, it's a little bit more of a diminuendo into the end of the note, but the mechanics have not changed. I've kept basically the fundamentals of my mechanics. So that's the first thing that you would start doing as your like intermediate level. And the second thing that you begin to play around with is a little bit of the rubato. And so there we're messing around with that concept of evenness. And I would say you can do this in two ways. Number one, you can do this by bringing out the melody rather than the upper half, rather than the pedal tones. Sometimes it's on the top. Sometimes, yeah. So it's almost always on the top, but I think like later in the tune it shifts to the bottom. But overall, bringing out in this case your down bows, and then lighten up. So we're changing the dynamics in order to bring out those bottom melody. That would be the first sort of upgrade. And then the second thing you can do, which is a little bit more fun, is you can explore a little bit of the rhythm as well. Maybe backing out into some of those harmonic changes. But what I would advise there is keeping a pretty constant pulse and trying to fit your rubato into that pulse so we don't lose the pulse. Oh, excuse me. So we don't lose the pulse. And that's the basically the next level would be adding that sort of rubato. After that, the only trick is going to be starting at the tempo that's really comfortable for your bow arm, and then slowly bringing the tempo up. And as you bring up the tempo, what's going to happen is sort of that rigidity of our arm that we talked about when we practice our marteles. We're going to have to be a little bit more relaxed about that, because when you go fast, you don't necessarily need to move your whole arm as a block. What you can do is you can prepare with your arm and then let your wrist follow. If you can see that in slow motion, at the end of the bow, and if I'm going from the D string to the E string, my arm starts getting me there, and then my wrist catches up to me. So you can be just a little bit flexible with what parts of your arm are moving, but still you want to be very, very careful that you don't leave the string until your note is finished. And I mean, it depends on actually what type of tone you're going for. If you want a really, really straight martele all the way to the end of the note, you don't have that much wiggle room to move your arm in order to prepare for the string crossing, because it will throw off sort of the straightness of the sound of your bow. But if you want it to be a little bit more ringing and sort of a more sort of a shaped note, then you can probably get away with loosening up the weight and preparing for your bow change. Let's move our attention now over to our left hand. And we're going to be talking about two main concepts that I think are quite interesting in this caprice for our left hand. And the first one is going to be more technical, and that is about our hand positions. And the second one is going to be a little bit more musical, I suppose, and that's going to be about listening for intonation and some of the challenges that we're going to explore there. So let's start off by talking about our left hand and the shape of our left hand. And the idea here is that this is a caprice that has a lot of extensions. And what I mean by extensions is that we don't really, we're not going to be spending a lot of time in a very basic first position or second or third position. Instead, a lot of the time our hand needs to be covering basically the distance of a tenth. And that's going to be when we play, tenths in double stops, actually, but also just overall as we are moving our way around the fingerboard through these scales and passages and pedal tones, we're going to be needing to be reaching all around. The good news is that we already started studying this in Caprice number 1, when we were building our hand position to work for chords, but now instead of playing those chords, we're going to be playing melodies. So the same idea that our hand now needs to be very, very comfortable reaching across the fingerboard, and that probably means figuring out what it means to have your hand at a certain angle. You're going to need to figure out what it means to reach your first finger back instead of having your first finger stuck. And there's even going to be some moments where we move our pinky around as well. So what it means to have your pinky comfortably in an octave and then reach it up to the 9th and reach it up to the 10th. And that is basically going to be the gist of this etude. How to practice that sort of thing? I would say what you want to be doing is learning, first of all, the hand positions that work for you in order to reach out to a 10th. And you want to also be learning how to reach your first finger back. So you can even do that very silently. You don't even need to play any notes. You would start off in 3rd position here with a, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th finger. And then can you relax your first finger and bring it back to the C sharp? Then can you relax your first finger even more and sort of see how it's at sort of a hooked angle all the way back to the first finger. And releasing your first finger from its stuck position is one of the things you're going to need to do in order to achieve this. Same thing with your 4th finger. So what you want to do is have your elbow around and your kind of hand nice and high that your 4th finger feels really comfortable in its normal first, well, it depends on if you're in 1st position or 3rd position, but in its normal position, and it's nice and bent. And then what happens when you give it a little reach up? And then what happens when you give it a little reach up again? And in order to do that, you have to be so loose with your hand, and you have to really trust that your thumb is supporting the fingerboard, and that'll allow you to loosen up your hand and reach all around. And so that would be the first focus area. Let's have a look at somewhere where that shows up. Oh, yes. I think this would be a good one. Maybe starting from measure 6. So here we are with holding a D and going back to 1st position. What you want to be doing there is really feeling that your hand is reaching back. And now you're in sort of this position that covers the entire fingerboard, but still very loose and flexible. So my hand is sort of somewhere around the 2nd position as a middle marker, but my 1st finger can reach back and my 4th finger can extend up. And even my thumb has sort of pulled a little bit forward. So those are just the tips that work for me in terms of my hand position, but you'll have to figure out what works for you because every hand is different, of course. So extensions. The second aspect of this caprice that I think we're going to be focusing on is, of course, intonation. And we have all of these pedal tones, which of course adds already a really, really helpful element for our intonation study. But I think what makes it even more complicated is that we have to be thinking in terms of really, really big interval gaps. And that's not something that we are used to all the time because we often study our intonation in the context of melodies, scales, arpeggios that are pretty much contained within octaves. But now all of a sudden we have to be expanding our awareness of our intonation to gaps that are 1 or even 2 octaves apart. So of course, the most famous example would be in measure 29, where we've finished up some tenths. And now we're going to be covering the entire range of the fingerboard. So just take it really, really slow and give your mind a chance to catch up to that huge gap in between all of these notes. So realize that they're the same thirds and tenths that you've been practicing this whole time. So they should sort of be in your ear, but you have to give your mind time and space to really begin to accommodate those huge interval gaps. That's basically the second major thing that I would encourage you to think about and to work on in this caprice. So let's finish off this video with a playthrough demonstration of the full caprice. And one thing you notice is that even though we've done exercises in the upper half with the martele or in the bottom half with some more spiccato, you're not relegated to only using one stroke for the entire caprice. In a performance capacity, you can definitely mix and match those different strokes depending on the colors or the mood changes, story that you want to tell with the tune. And I have Schirmer edition. And what you notice is they're pretty explicit about putting different phrases in different parts of the bow, depending on how the melody goes, where the string crossings are, and that's definitely a suggestion for how to do it. But you can go to YouTube and watch different examples, and every performer would do it a little bit differently. But nonetheless, once you've done all of your exercises in different parts of the bow, you'll be very well equipped to just cutting and mixing and matching the different styles that you want. I like it a lot in the upper half. I like that martele and either giving a sharp martele with some accents or a little bit rounded to lighten up the tone and achieve some dynamics. But totally up to you. And after you've done your bow exercises, that'll come as the next step. So good luck learning this one, and we'll see you for Caprice number 3.